David Turner first noticed the woman in late October, not because she was unusual. Not really. Plenty of people came and went through the cafe. Students with laptops, parents bribing exhausted children with cake, people pretending to work while mostly staring out of windows. The woman simply returned every Wednesday, same time, same table, and after a while, routine made her impossible not to notice. David came to the corner cafe every Wednesday too, not for any particular reason. At least, that was what he told himself. The truth was slightly sadder. Wednesdays felt long, too quiet, the sort of afternoons that stretched awkwardly when there was nowhere particular to be. So every Wednesday at 1 o'clock, David ordered tea, soup, and whatever cake looked least disappointing. Routine had become oddly comforting, safe somehow. The cafe sat on a quiet corner of the high street. Warm lighting, slightly crooked picture frames, a fire that looked real, but probably wasn't. The sort of place where nobody rushed you. David usually sat near the window, and every Wednesday, without fail, at exactly 1:30 p.m., the woman arrived. Always alone, always carrying the same neat handbag, always dressed carefully, as though Wednesday mattered. She sat at the little corner table, the one near the bookshelf, and every single week, she ordered, "Tea for 2, please." David had noticed that first, then, "And 2 slices of lemon drizzle, if you still have it." 2, always 2, even though nobody ever came. At first, he assumed someone was running late, a daughter perhaps, a friend, grandchild. But nobody arrived. Not after 10 minutes, not after an hour, not ever. And stranger still, she always kept glancing toward the cafe door. Not anxiously, not sadly, exactly. Just expectantly. Like habit had become stronger than disappointment. Then, one Wednesday, while paying, David overheard something. The young waitress smiled awkwardly. "Will your guest be joining you today?" The woman looked toward the empty chair, then smiled softly. "Oh, yes," she said. "He's just running a little late." David glanced over. The chair stayed empty. The tea slowly cooled, and for reasons he couldn't quite explain. He found himself thinking about it all the way home. David told himself it was none of his business, repeatedly, firmly, in the sort of internal voice usually reserved for poor decisions and supermarket biscuits. The woman at the corner table was simply a person having tea. That was all. Perfectly normal, if slightly confusing. Yet, somehow, every Wednesday, he found himself noticing. Not deliberately. At least, that was what he preferred to believe. Still, by November, he had learned things. Entirely by accident. Mostly. She always arrived at 1:30 p.m. Never early. Never late. Always ordered tea for 2. Always lemon drizzle cake if the cafe still had any. And every single week, without fail, she placed 1 teaspoon neatly beside the empty cup. The little things unsettled him somehow. Not dramatic things. Just careful things. Habit things. The sort of details people stopped noticing unless they mattered. One Wednesday, rain battered softly against the cafe windows. The kind of miserable drizzle that made everyone look vaguely disappointed to be outside. David arrived early, mostly because there was nothing particularly waiting for him at home. He ordered tea, sat near the window, opened a newspaper he had no intention of properly reading. At 1:30 sharp, the woman arrived. Same handbag, same careful coat, same table, same order. Tea for 2, lemon drizzle. Then, something changed. The young waitress frowned apologetically. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. "We've sold out of lemon drizzle today." The woman paused, just for a second, then smiled politely. "Oh." Not upset exactly, but something about the way she looked at the empty cake stand made David unexpectedly sad. "Chocolate instead?" the waitress offered kindly. The woman hesitated, then gave the smallest shake of her head. "No, thank you." She looked toward the empty chair, then quietly added, "He only ever liked the lemon one." The waitress smiled politely, slightly uncertain, then hurried away. David looked down at his newspaper, immediately regretted overhearing, because suddenly, without permission, curiosity arrived properly. Not gossip, not nosiness, just concern. Because no one ever came, not once, and yet the second cup still arrived, the second teaspoon. The empty chair remained waiting, week after week. David told himself to stop thinking about it. Naturally, he thought about almost nothing else. By the following Wednesday, he had somehow become the sort of person who quietly checked whether a stranger had arrived at a café, which felt deeply embarrassing. The woman was already there when he arrived, tea steaming softly between two untouched cups, the empty chair waiting opposite. Outside, cold November light stretched across the pavement. Inside, everything felt warm, busy, comfortable, except somehow that little table near the bookshelf. That table always seemed slightly quieter than the rest, like it belonged to its own kind of time. David ordered tea, sat down, told himself firmly, "You are absolutely not getting involved." Then, without entirely deciding to, he glanced over. The woman caught him looking and smiled. Oh no, David considered leaving immediately, not because he wanted to, because somehow being noticed had made everything feel alarmingly real. For several weeks now, he had quietly turned this woman into a mystery, a Wednesday puzzle. Puzzles were much easier when they did not smile back at you. Still, leaving now would look odd, suspicious even, like a man fleeing accidental friendliness. So instead, he performed what he believed was a very normal nod, the sort of polite acknowledgement strangers exchanged every day. Unfortunately, the woman smiled again, warmer this time. Oh dear. David looked quickly at his tea, the universal signal for "I am suddenly extremely busy." Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the corner cafe hummed quietly around him. Coffee cups, low conversations, the hiss of milk steaming somewhere behind the counter. Comfortable sounds, the kind that made loneliness feel less obvious. David unfolded his newspaper, held it open, read exactly none of it, because every few minutes, against his better judgment, he found himself glancing toward the little table near the bookshelf. The woman sat quietly, tea untouched, looking occasionally toward the door, never impatient, never upset, just waiting. At 2:10, something unexpected happened. The waitress approached David's table, holding a small plate, lemon drizzle cake. David frowned. "I didn't order that." The waitress smiled. "You didn't." She nodded discreetly toward the corner table. "The lady over there said you looked like someone who could do with cheering up." David blinked. "What?" "She insisted." Before he could object, the waitress disappeared again. David looked slowly toward the woman. She lifted her teacup slightly, like a tiny toast, completely unembarrassed. David stared at the cake, then, despite himself, gave the smallest reluctant nod. The woman smiled, satisfied, as though some perfectly reasonable Wednesday business had now been completed. Honestly. The nerve. Still, he ate the cake, mostly because refusing free cake seemed unnecessarily dramatic. And annoyingly, it was very good. By 2:40, the cafe had started to quieten. The rain eased. People drifted home. The woman remained. Tea for two still resting on the table. One untouched. Eventually, David stood to leave, collected his coat, prepared for the sort of polite escape adults perfected. Then, without warning, the woman spoke. "You know," she said pleasantly, "most people just say hello." David stopped, turned slowly. The woman looked entirely too amused with herself. He hesitated, then sighed quietly. "I wasn't staring." "No," she said kindly. "You were wondering." David opened his mouth, closed it again. Fair. Then, before he could invent something sensible, she smiled toward the empty chair. "Would you like to sit down for 5 minutes?" Oh dear, David hesitated. Every sensible instinct suggested politely declining. Something brief, something adult, something involving, "Lovely to meet you, but I really must be going." Instead, for reasons he could not entirely explain, he heard himself say, 5 minutes. The woman smiled immediately, victorious, as though this outcome had never truly been in doubt. "Good," she said. "You looked lonely." David blinked. "Well?" That was deeply rude. The woman gestured to the empty chair. "Sit down before you make this awkward." David gave her a look. "I feel I should point out," he said carefully, "that you are technically the person making this awkward." "Oh, nonsense," she replied. "You've been quietly investigating me for 6 weeks. David opened his mouth, closed it again. Fair. Annoyingly fair. He sat down. The second teacup sat untouched between them. Steam long gone. The empty chair beside him somehow felt oddly important up close. The woman held out a hand. "Margaret." "David." "Well then," Margaret said pleasantly, "now we're no longer pretending not to know each other." David glanced awkwardly toward the door, still mentally evaluating escape routes. Margaret noticed immediately. "Oh, don't worry," she said kindly. "I'm not going to trap you in a conversation about gardening." David hesitated. "I don't mind gardening." "Well, now I'm disappointed." Against all logic, he laughed, just slightly. Margaret looked pleased with herself. The dangerous thing, David realized, was that she seemed entirely comfortable. No awkwardness, no fuss. Like inviting strangers to tea every Wednesday was perfectly ordinary behavior. Eventually, trying very hard to sound casual, David glanced toward the second cup. "So," he hesitated, because British people did not ask personal questions, not directly, not unless emotionally cornered. Margaret saved him the trouble. "You want to know why I order tea for 2? Not accusing, just observant. David looked mildly horrified. "I wasn't." "You were." Fair again. Margaret stirred her tea slowly, looked toward the empty chair, then smiled, softly this time. Not sad exactly, just familiar. "My husband," she said. "Arthur." The cafe hummed quietly around them, rain soft against the windows. David waited. Something about the way she said his name made interruption feel impossible. Margaret glanced at the second teacup. "We used to come every Wednesday." A pause. "Same table." Another pause. "Same cake." David looked at the untouched cup, then quietly asked, "And now?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Now I still come." Simple. No drama. no tears, just true. And somehow, that made it sadder. David left the cafe 20 minutes later, which annoyed him slightly, because the agreement had very clearly been 5 minutes, not 20. 20 suggested enjoyment, and enjoyment suggested dangerous levels of human involvement. The rain had stopped by then, cold November air drifting quietly along the high street. David walked home telling himself, firmly, that the entire thing had simply been an odd little conversation. Nothing more. Perfectly ordinary. He would return next Wednesday. Order tea, sit by the window, mind his own business, and absolutely not become emotionally involved in a stranger's weekly routine. Simple. Unfortunately, by Saturday, he found himself wondering whether Margaret had finished the lemon drizzle cake. By Monday, he caught himself thinking, Arthur, as though he somehow knew him. By Tuesday, without fully understanding why, he felt strangely relieved. Wednesday was approaching, which was deeply embarrassing. The following Wednesday arrived cold and bright. David got to the corner cafe at 1:15 p.m. Pure coincidence, obviously. Nothing whatsoever to do with habit, or curiosity, or wondering whether Margaret would be there. He sat near the window, ordered tea, pretended to read the newspaper. At 1:30 exactly, the door opened. Same coat, same careful handbag, same determined little walk. Margaret spotted him immediately, then frowned. "Well," she said, "you're in my line of sight now." David blinked. "Sorry? You were easier to ignore over there." David gave her a look. "You invited me to tea." "Yes," Margaret said calmly. "And now look what's happened." Before David could answer, the waitress appeared, smiling knowingly. "The usual Margaret?" "Yes, please," Margaret said. Then, without even asking, added, "And tea for David." David frowned. "I can order my own tea." "You can," Margaret agreed, "but you won't." Which, annoyingly, turned out to be true. The second teacup arrived, this time placed directly in front of him. No empty chair between them, no pretending. Margaret looked oddly pleased, as though she had quietly solved something. David glanced toward the untouched side of the table. No second cake today, no second cup waiting, just tea. And somehow, he noticed the difference. Margaret followed his glance. "Oh," she said gently. "Arthur won't mind." David looked back at her. What changed? Margaret stirred her tea thoughtfully, then smiled. "Well," she shrugged slightly. "No point setting a place for someone when another lonely person's already sitting there." David looked down into his tea, because somehow, unexpectedly, that landed rather heavily. Not awkward, not uncomfortable. Just true. Margaret took a sip of tea, then said casually, "So?" David immediately became suspicious. "What? You look like someone who lives alone." David blinked. "That feels oddly personal." "I'm 78, Margaret said. "I've earned the right to be nosy." Against all logic, David laughed. Again. Honestly. This was getting concerning. By the third Wednesday, David had stopped pretending coincidence was involved. Slightly. He still arrived early, still ordered tea, still carried a newspaper he barely looked at. But now, instead of sitting near the window, he sat at the corner table. Margaret's table, though she would very firmly call it our Wednesday table, which David considered unnecessarily possessive. At 1:30 exactly, the cafe door opened. Margaret stepped inside, paused, then smiled. "Well," she said, "you're already here." David folded his newspaper carefully. I happened to be nearby. Margaret looked entirely unconvinced. David, yes? You're retired. Fair. Deeply rude, but fair. Margaret removed her coat, sat down. The waitress arrived almost immediately, smiling. The usual? Margaret nodded. Yes, please. Then pointed at David, and whatever he pretends he wasn't going to order. David sighed quietly. I liked it better when we ignored each other. No, you didn't. Again, annoyingly, true. Tea arrived, followed by cake. Lemon drizzle this time. Margaret looked unexpectedly pleased. Arthur would approve. David glanced toward the cake, then at her. You talk about him like he's still around. Margaret stirred her tea slowly. Not upset, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Well, she said eventually, some people leave louder than others. David frowned slightly. Margaret looked toward the window. At first, after he died. She hesitated, then gave the smallest shrug. I stopped coming. A pause. 3 Wednesdays. David stayed quiet, because somehow that number sounded oddly important. Then Margaret smiled faintly. And I hated it. Simple. Honest. The house felt too quiet. Another pause. So I came back. She looked toward the table, the cups, the little bookshelf nearby. This was ours for 42 years. David blinked. 42. That suddenly felt enormous. Margaret smiled softly. You don't stop missing someone because they're gone. Then, before the conversation could become too heavy, she pointed toward David's untouched cake. Eat that. David frowned. I was listening. You can listen and eat. That feels judgmental. It's practical. Against all logic, he laughed again. And somewhere, without either of them really noticing, Wednesday stopped feeling quite so long. By December, Wednesday had quietly become part of David's week. Not officially, obviously. He still refused to describe it as plans. That sounded far too committed. Still, every Wednesday at 1:30, he found himself at the corner café. Tea, cake, Margaret. And somehow, without ever discussing it, the routine had settled around them, comfortably, like something old rather than new. The dangerous thing, David realized, was that he had started looking forward to it, which felt suspicious. At first, they spoke about ordinary things. Weather, the terrible state of parking, whether supermarkets intentionally moved items to irritate people. Margaret held very strong opinions about soup. David learned this unexpectedly. Apparently, no proper cafe should trust coriander, which somehow became an argument lasting nearly 40 minutes. Then, slowly, the conversations widened. David spoke about his son, Tom, living in Manchester, busy, always meaning to visit. Margaret listened carefully, never unkind, never pitying, just interested. And in return, Margaret told stories about Arthur. Not sad stories, mostly funny ones. Arthur locking himself out of the house 3 times in one winter. Arthur insisting he could fix things he absolutely could not fix. Arthur somehow setting fire to Christmas pudding once. Honestly, Margaret said one Wednesday, I married a lovely man with absolutely no practical skills. David frowned slightly. That sounds oddly familiar. Margaret gave him a look. You strike me as exactly the sort of man who owns 6 screwdrivers and still has things not fixed. David looked offended. That feels personal? It was meant to. By Christmas, David realized something uncomfortable. The house felt quieter on days that weren't Wednesday. Not sad exactly, just emptier, which seemed unfair. Because somehow, without permission, Margaret had quietly become important. Then, one Wednesday, at 1:40, Margaret didn't arrive. David frowned, looked toward the cafe door. Nothing. At 1:50, he checked his watch. Again. Still nothing. At 2 o'clock, the waitress approached quietly. "You all right?" David blinked. "What?" "You keep looking at the door." David immediately looked offended. "I'm not." The waitress raised an eyebrow, then gently said, "Margaret rang this morning." Something uncomfortable shifted quietly in his chest. "She's poorly," the waitress said. "Chest infection." David looked toward the empty chair, the untouched teacup, the strange quietness of the table. And for the first time, he understood something properly. The cafe hadn't felt warmer because of routine, or tea, or cake. It had been warmer because someone had been waiting for him too. Oh dear. David finished his tea, though finished was generous. Mostly, he stared at it, occasionally lifted the cup, forgot to drink, put it back down again. The empty chair opposite him felt oddly wrong. Too quiet. The cafe somehow colder than usual, which annoyed him, because this was ridiculous. He'd known Margaret, what, a couple of months? And yet, Wednesday suddenly felt unfinished. The waitress passed his table while collecting cups. "You all right?" she asked gently. David looked mildly offended. "Yes." A pause. Then, before he could stop himself, "Is Margaret all right?" The waitress smiled slightly. "There we are." David frowned. "What?" "You asked." David sighed quietly. "I was being polite." Very annoying. "She's all right," the waitress said kindly. "Just not feeling well." David nodded, looked toward the empty chair again. Still there. Waiting. Strange. How quickly absence changed a room. The waitress hesitated for a second, then reached into her apron pocket. "Oh," she said. "She asked me to give you this if you came in." David blinked. "Me?" The waitress handed over a folded napkin, his name written across the front, in very determined handwriting. David, something unexpectedly warm shifted quietly in his chest. He unfolded it carefully. Inside, David. "Apparently my lungs have decided to become dramatic. Doctor says rest. Rude. Don't start enjoying the piece too much. Back soon." Margaret David stared at it for longer than strictly necessary, then, despite himself, laughed quietly. The dangerous thing, he realized, was that he had been worried, actually worried, and somehow that felt rather important. The waitress smiled. "She said to tell you she fully expects complaints if they stop making decent tea before she gets back." David folded the napkin carefully, far more carefully than necessary. "Sounds like her?" Then, after a pause, he looked toward the empty chair one last time. Still strange, still too quiet, but somehow not quite so worrying now, because suddenly, Wednesday didn't feel finished, just postponed. The following Wednesday, David arrived at the corner cafe at 1:20 p.m. Not because he expected Margaret to be back. Obviously, that would suggest optimism, or concern, or emotional investment, none of which he was prepared to admit to. Still, he found himself glancing toward the cafe door far more often than strictly necessary. The little corner table remained empty. The waitress caught him looking once, said absolutely nothing, which somehow felt worse. By 1:30, David had almost convinced himself Margaret wouldn't be back yet, which, if he were honest, made the cafe feel oddly flat, too quiet somehow. At 1:34, The cafe door opened. Same coat, same handbag, slightly slower walk this time, but unmistakably, Margaret. David sat up before he could stop himself, then immediately pretended he had not. Margaret spotted him instantly, paused, looked deeply pleased. "Well," she said, removing her coat, "you came back." David frowned. "I usually come back." "Yes," Margaret said calmly, "but now I know you mean it." Deeply suspicious sentence. Margaret sat down slowly. The waitress appeared almost immediately. "You're back." "Apparently," Margaret said dryly. "My lungs have been dramatic enough." Then she glanced toward David. "You didn't enjoy the piece too much, I hope." David hesitated, because somehow, saying, "Actually, Wednesday felt strangely lonely without you," felt entirely too revealing. So instead, he settled for, "The tea was worse." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "You're lying. A little." That earned a smile. The kind that said, "Ah, there you are. Tea arrived. Cake, too. Lemon drizzle." Margaret looked smug. "See?" she said. "Worth surviving for." David looked at the cake, then at her. "You know," he said carefully, "most people would probably just rest when they're ill." Margaret stirred her tea. "Most people are boring." Fair. They sat quietly for a while. Comfortable quiet this time. Not awkward. Not forced. Outside. December light faded early against the windows. Inside, the little table near the bookshelf felt warm again, occupied properly. Eventually, Margaret glanced toward him. "You were worried." David looked horrified. "I was not. You absolutely were. I asked one question. You kept my note." David paused. Because unfortunately, she was correct. The folded napkin still sat neatly in his coat pocket. Margaret looked entirely too pleased with herself. "Oh dear," she said gently. "You've accidentally become fond of me." David sighed. Deeply. Because somehow, annoyingly, she might be right. Winter settled quietly after that. The sort of winter made softer by routine. Wednesday became, without either of them ever officially agreeing to it, unchangeable. At 1:30 p.m., tea, cake, mild disagreement, Margaret pretending not to interfere in David's life while interfering constantly. David pretending not to enjoy this while very clearly enjoying it. There were rules now. Apparently, David learned these accidentally. Rule 1. Never criticize cafe tea loudly enough for Margaret to hear. Rule 2. Never trust soup described as interesting. Rule 3, according to Margaret, was always tell someone if you're going to disappear. That one, David quietly noticed. She said more than once, as though it mattered, as though loneliness had taught her something she wasn't entirely saying aloud. Then, one rainy Wednesday in February, David arrived first. Unusual. Margaret was almost never late. At 1:35, nothing. At 1:40, still nothing. David frowned, checked the door, tried not to become dramatic. At 1:45, the waitress arrived holding a folded napkin. David stared at it immediately. "Oh no," he said. The waitress smiled. "Relax." He frowned. "I am relaxed. You look like someone waiting for exam results." "Fair." She handed him the note, his name written across the front. Very determined handwriting. "David," Bus broke down. "Entirely unreasonable behavior. Order tea. Don't start acting abandoned." Margaret David let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, then frowned, mostly at himself, because apparently, somewhere along the way, Wednesday had stopped, being somewhere he went, and quietly become somewhere he belonged. 20 minutes later, the cafe door opened. Margaret marched in, looking deeply unimpressed with public transport, then stopped, spotted him, and smiled. "Well," she said, "you stayed." David looked at her, then at the chair opposite, the one that somehow no longer looked empty. "Course I stayed," he said, as though there had ever been another option. Margaret sat down, removed her coat, looked oddly pleased. The waitress brought tea without asking, lemon drizzle too. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the little corner table near the bookshelf felt warm, occupied, familiar, and for reasons neither of them would probably ever say out loud. Life felt a little less lonely than it had before. Margaret lifted her teacup. "Same time next Wednesday?" David frowned. "As if you'd let me miss it." "Correct." And somehow, that felt rather nice.